Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a Senior Power Platform Specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. Welcome everyone to this Friday learning session. Today's topic is going to be the SharePoint REST API and how we can leverage it in Power Automate. The reason for this topic is I'm getting a lot of queries at the moment in terms of some of my consultancy work where clients are after SharePoint-based management systems built out of Power Platform. And so I'm doing a lot of work in SharePoint REST API. But alongside that, I know that from my citizen developer days and from managing a citizen developer community, that a lot of people who first start off in the Power Platform start building a lot of their solutions with SharePoint-backed kind of canvas apps. And when it comes to application lifecycle management of SharePoint sites within Power Platform solutions, it can be quite tricky and tedious having to kind of rebuild lists and do all sorts of other things. And actually, from that feeling that frustration myself, I've dug through the SharePoint REST API documentation to pull out some really cool endpoints that actually means that I don't ever have to recreate a list again. I can just copy and paste it, and that's one of the things that we'll be showing today. So the reason for the session is essentially to share that knowledge, for people to ask questions about SharePoint REST API and why we might use it and how we leverage it in Power Automate. Today's session does have an agenda, so obviously we're in the introduction now. We're going to be covering essentially a few key points. So we're going to be covering an overview what SharePoint REST API is and what it means. For those who may not know, it's useful to get a hold of that. We're going to be covering why it's useful specifically within Power Automate. So this is stuff that's over and above kind of your usual Power Automate inbuilt SharePoint actions. We're going to just look at how we read the documentation because personally from my perspective, first starting to read the documentation that's presented around the SharePoint REST API can be quite difficult to get your head around. But once you've learned that and you've learned kind of the basics of how to structure that and then how to convert what the documentation says into how you implement it in Power Automate, it becomes really powerful and useful. And then we're going to look at some of the useful and cool endpoints that I've found and managed to make use of. And yeah, give you an idea of kind of what can really be done, because when we talk about SharePoint REST API, it's not just working with list items and data. It can also be doing things like managing content from the content hub, or like I said, copying and pasting lists or document libraries, or getting site scripts and a few other things that can be done in Power Automate using SharePoint REST API. So that's the agenda. Cover this on every session. Kind of, I refer to them as rules of engagement, but this is essentially our rule set for the session. Now, I am a firm believer in there is no such thing as a stupid question. I have a very young daughter. She tests that assumption every day, and then she's yet to find one. We've had questions around why the sky is blue and why do the bees like the flowers, and I do love to answer them. So if you're ever not sure about something or you want to ask, during the course of the session, like I said, feel free to post it in the chat for this kind of Discord. Um, and there will be a section at the end for Q&A, where essentially I will stop the recording and people will be able to essentially ask to speak, and they can ask their question. We can also open it up for discussion as well. That is my only kind of real rule, in that we don't ask to speak during the session, because that might be that I cover things as we go through the session, but after that's done, we're free to go. So, getting straight into it then. What is SharePoint REST API? Well, in terms of SharePoint REST API, essentially the REST API, So essentially the REST API is, like all other APIs, a way to connect to SharePoint using the web. So this is things like being able to send it information. A lot of the time we look at APIs and we see them in pro code, but actually SharePoint REST API has a really, really useful kind of space within Power Automate. So when we look at the SharePoint REST API, it's a set of endpoints, a set of URLs that you can use to target to send information that allows SharePoint to carry out a set of actions. This API specifically allows apps and tools to communicate with SharePoint to do things like getting data, updating list items, or performing tasks like creating SharePoint sites. The best way I like to think of it is essentially a digital assistant for SharePoint. I give it a set of instructions and it goes away and does the thing for me, rather than me having to interact with either the SharePoint admin center or an item in a list or things like that. And I do that by sending a request, and then it'll give me a nice little, a lot of the time, a bit of feedback saying, hey, I've completed the task. And we'll see that in kind of how when we look at some of the useful endpoints that we've got at the end. Yeah, that's the SharePoint REST API, and it's extensive. There is an endpoint for pretty much any kind of action in SharePoint, bar one or two. So why is it useful? Well, I put this slide in here because when I start to talk about SharePoint REST API with a lot of other people, they go, "Oh, well, we just use the standard actions that are available in SharePoint. The things like available in Power Automate for SharePoint. So things like update an item or things like create new item or bits like that. So while the built-in actions in Power Automate for SharePoint are good, they are limited. For instance, you can't manage things like content types. So for those who don't know, there are things that are called content types in SharePoint that allow you to do things like create document sets, which filter down kind of metadata tags to the items that are underneath the document set. And that can be really useful. But the management of those content types manually can sometimes be quite laborious. And when you're, for instance, creating an entirely new SharePoint site, you want to be able to kind of add those content types programmatically. The inbuilt SharePoint actions don't allow you to do that. So in that instance, you have to use the SharePoint REST API to do that. The other thing is you can't set unique permissions using the inbuilt kind of SharePoint actions. So that's item level permissions on SharePoint documents, which can be exceptionally useful in certain cases. So alongside these kind of extra functionality that the SharePoint REST API gives us and makes available to us in Power Automate, it also can make our Power Automate flows that deal with SharePoint items significantly more streamlined and really improve that performance. So one of the things that I use SharePoint REST API for quite often when it comes to SharePoint lists is to do batch updates of items. So a good example of this improved performance is one of the common patterns we see when we're using common SharePoint actions is an update item action inside an apply to each loop. And what that does is it basically sends 100 update item requests to SharePoint and says, hey, just do this one, and then do this one, and then do this one. And obviously, there is a concurrency bit that you can set there on the apply to each. But actually, with SharePoint REST API, what we can do is send one request and say, hey, go away, update all of these items at once. And that way, you're only making one request. You're not counting 100 requests towards your API call limit. You're just making one SharePoint HTTP kind of REST API request, and off we go. Um, there is a brief table here in terms of kind of why it's useful and some of the benefits over and above the standard actions, and kind of definition as to where you might use standard actions. So, as I said, with standard actions, you're limited to the predefined actions that the Power Automate SharePoint connector provides you. They're really useful, these standard actions, when you want really quick, easy of use, quick setup, and you're not doing kind of multiple updates or other items. Um, Really useful things like creating and updating single individual list items, and really useful for kind of your citizen developer kind of level and you're kind of first starting off. But when you get into things like managing content types, creating sites, site templating, site scripting, things like that, this is where SharePoint REST API comes into its own. And when you have the need to provide advanced filters on top of that for getting data, this is the SharePoint REST API is that much better. So that's why it's useful. The big thing, how to read the documentation. Like I said, when I first started kind of digging into SharePoint REST API, I started to look on the Microsoft Learn site at the documentation there, and I found it quite confusing. It can sometimes lend itself towards falling down a rabbit hole. So there are two types of documentation that you might encounter. You've got this version, yep. So this is essentially the endpoint tree, as they put it. It's the SharePoint 2013 REST syntax poster. So you'll see a few of these, and encountering this as the first in your first step of like looking at what SharePoint REST API is and how do I use it in Power Automate and what endpoints there are becomes quite difficult. The other kind of documentation that you might look at is this Microsoft Learn site here, where as you can see, it's very much kind of geared towards coding in JavaScript. It's not very Power Automate friendly, and there are some kind of sites that look at what endpoints can be used, but the parts of the SharePoint REST API that are really cool are normally stuck behind kind of this kind of documentation. Some of the basic ones around creating items, batch updating items, there are already kind of guides out there on how to write that, how the Power Automate action looks. But once you start to understand how to read the documentation and essentially how to change what they give you and put it into something that's usable in Power Automate is really powerful. So to actually understand the documentation to start with, you need to know the basics. So what does an REST API call require? So when we look at Power Automate, the specific action that we use to send HTTP requests to SharePoint requests a site address and a URI. Oh, Manoj, that's a really good question, and actually one thing I was going to show in terms of looking at some of the REST API points. So the actual action itself to send a REST API call to SharePoint does not require premium licensing. So as long as you have a Power Apps basic license, it works, and it works right ahead. And actually, that's one of the benefits of the process of implementation I'm going to show. Um, Again, in terms of the documentation, so understanding those basics, the Power Automate action for sending a REST API call to SharePoint requires a site address, but it also requires something called a URI, which is the endpoint. This is essentially a web address where you want to send your request to. You've got to understand the different types of HTTP methods that you might use. So there's, I believe, if I remember correctly, there's 5 of them, but 2 of them do relatively the same thing. So there's a get HTTP method which retrieves data from the endpoint that you query. There's the post method which adds new data, so that's what would be used to do creating multiple items at once. We have the put method which updates existing data, or the patch method which updates existing data, and the delete method which allows you to remove data. Um, Next bit in terms of structuring that is a set of headers and a body, which is the content you want to send. Now, in terms of that structure, when we look at the documentation, you'll see up here that we have, at least within the tree view, the HTTP server name site / API web. Now, when we talked about obviously the site address that is requested in an action, that's this bit, just there. This is the start of any API call, so we have _API web. And then you have a set of endpoints that fall beneath that. So when you look at this, that's saying, okay, we need to look at this as / API web. So let's say I'm going to look at the lists and list items one because it's quite a common one. We go / API web and then saying, okay, we need to put a / in front of that. We want to access lists because that's where items sit. And then let's say we want to get a list in the site that we've listed here by title. We put / get by title. And then in brackets, we put the name of the list that we're trying to get. And then again, you can put / then items. And as you can see, it kind of shows you what the syntax is supposed to look like and what your URI. These are used to construct those URIs. So that's what this documentation is about. And again, when we look at this, we have a complete URI kind of here around creating site scripts and a few other things and getting site scripts and how those are produced. Again, when we look at reading that documentation, it's all about kind of picking up, okay, what's the URI I'm targeting? That's what a lot of the documentation focuses on, is what's the URI to do the thing that we need to do. Now, this will make a bit more sense when we move on to the next bit. Useful endpoints to know. So we've read the documentation, we know how to look and pick out a URI. Well, actually, how do we take that URI and put it into Power Automate? Well, this is where we look into actual Power Automate actions. So I've got 2 examples of kind of using the SharePoint REST API. One of them is using the SharePoint Designer REST API to copy and paste lists. This is the SharePoint Designer one. So this is our list copy and paste application here. So what I've got is very simply, have to bear with me, it's being slow today. I wonder if that extension's still in there. So what we've got here is essentially a way for me to copy and paste lists. And all this does is it runs this copy list button, runs a list copier Power Automate. You can see here. And what I'm doing is I'm here, get original site details. So when we talked about the documentation itself, we have the site address. So when we look at that, as I said, that's this bit, HTTP server name / site. That's our site address. So we've covered that bit with this here. Now that's normally a site, just a plain site URL for the purpose of this. That is what is input here. That can just be a hard-coded value. We have a method. So I talked a moment ago about the methods that are kind of applied. When we're looking at this, this is a post method because I want to be able to create a site script. So I'm creating something, so I'm going to use the post method. I have my URI, so you can see here, / API. And then I've got my endpoint there. We've got headers in terms of obviously the accept and the content type. These are the most common ones you'll see in terms of accept and content type. These essentially define what you're looking to input there. So you can see there I'm saying, hey, I'm going to use JSON for my body, and any OData that I input will be verbose in terms of we might be using kind of OData filter queries in there or other options. With this endpoint specifically, I'm providing the URL to the list to be able to essentially create a site script that I can run in other SharePoint sites to be able to paste a list. But all this is doing is getting a site script from list. That's the endpoint. So using SharePoint REST API there, what we can do is we can copy a list that we've already got and paste it somewhere else. Now, the reason I'm showing this one is, like I said, when you first start out with Power Platform, you spend a lot of your time building SharePoint lists, and then when you start to get into the realm of application lifecycle management, you realize, I'm going to have to build 3 versions of that list, one for dev, one for test, one for production. Well, now I never have to do that again. I build it in dev, I use the site script to copy the lists, and then I have a secondary flow, which is this one here, to execute that site script that I've just taken from this flow and paste the list. Job done. So all of that has been done without any kind of premium connectors. I've not had to manually go ahead and recreate the list in this other site. I've just created the site and then run this against it. Means that we now no longer have to redo that. And it also means we've saved a bit of time as devs having to work in SharePoint. Exactly that. Saves cost as well. So when it comes to from a consultancy perspective, it means that when I do quotation for SharePoint based Canvas apps or bits like that, I can reduce my time. Because I can turn around and say, well, it's not going to take me so long because I'm not going to have to spend the time to rebuild the SharePoint lists that side as well. And because it's not licensed, it sits there and I don't have to worry about Dataverse or that aspect or premium licensing. The other aspect as well is that when we're looking at these REST API calls, they actually respect the permissions of the person running the flow. So for me to be able to copy a list using this REST API call in Power Automate, I have to be an owner on the site for the list I'm trying to copy, and I also, to be able to paste the list, have to be an owner on the site I am copying it to or pasting it in. That kind of level of intrinsic kind of permissioning there in terms of this Power Automate REST API call to SharePoint is much better because then it's managed through the SharePoint permissions rather than having to mess around with kind of authentication like you'd have to do if you were running it through PowerShell or through kind of pro code means. But that is essentially the REST API kind of designer. The actual action that's used to create this is very simple. So both of these are a send an HTTP request to SharePoint. That is the action that you use to send any REST API call into SharePoint. So I'm going to pause there for questions if anybody's got one. Manoj, I can see that you've got there in terms of SharePoint lists have an SQL query with tables which integrate Dataverse. Is it more convenient to use the REST API? So this is where we get into the trick of how we syncing data. So if we're looking at that in terms of you've got an SQL query that's feeding data into a SharePoint list or kind of matching the two, or it's feeding data into Dataverse, my immediate question would be why have you got from a consultant's perspective would be why have we got three different data stores? What's the need for that? And if we're already using Dataverse, why don't we keep using that? Because that actually unlocks a lot more capability than SharePoint would. It might be a data surfacing issue, but again, if you're using SharePoint as the host list and then syncing it back to SQL and Dataverse, that's a slightly different story if you're doing mass data edits on the SharePoint front. It depends on the solution, I think, is the answer. For more security in Dataverse, that makes sense. So when we're looking at that, if you're editing the data in Dataverse, Dataverse does actually have a web API, but you've also got bulk operations that you can already run in Power Automate via Dataverse anyway. The Dataverse kind of action set within Power Automate is significantly more fleshed out than the SharePoint one. Okay, right. Some other actions then. Working with document libraries and lists. So this one is a designer, SharePoint designer. You can see here Microsoft SharePoint Utilities web templates. SharePoint Designer is a lesser known REST API. The reason I show it here is because not very many people know about it or know that it exists, and I think it's really powerful and useful. Even I'm still digging through it to pick out what's actually useful. I mean, just the other day I found a REST API endpoint that can copy the entire contents of a document library and move it across to another document library and another site collection without changing things like the author or other items. So there's more to find there, but this is just an example of how powerful this REST API can be. But working with document libraries and lists, which is what a lot of us end up doing, because you might hold your data in SharePoint. When we look at working with document libraries and lists, I've got a flow here that essentially creates a new document library and creates views and adds specific fields to that document library. Does quite a lot, and then there's also adding custom format to list view. So this specific flow is more about creating a document library from scratch and making it look really cool. So when we look at this, I've got all of these are a send an HTTP request to SharePoint. So every single one of these actions and the outcome of them is done by SharePoint REST API. When we look at this, this one creates a document library. It's very simple. It's underscore API /web /lists, and it's a post. I set my content type, and then I have a load of settings in here that allow me to do certain things. So you'll see here base template. So this is really interesting. For those that don't know, there are a few base templates for lists in SharePoint. There's 101, which is a document library, and there's 100, which is just your normal SharePoint lists. So they are essentially all classed as lists. They all come under the same endpoint. But what I'm saying here is with this body, I'm saying, hey, this is going to be a document library, not a list. I want content types to be allowed. I want content types to be enabled to be true. I want to call the document library this, so a year number in the case of this, and I want it to have this specific description. Um, Makes it nice and easy, nice and quick. So that's obviously creating a document library, a very simple action, which actually, we can do pretty quickly in the actual interaction space of of SharePoint when we're a site owner. Adding content types. Now, this is one of the things that we don't have an inbuilt action for in the SharePoint standard actions. So I want to be able to add a content type. Now, very simply, what used to happen is, what now has to happen is you go into the document library, you go to add column, you then have to go to scroll down at the very bottom, hit add content type, and select from there, or you have to add it from the content type hub. Well, actually, what I can do here is I can just run this specific kind of endpoint. So you can see there, I've got underscore API web list get by title. Now, if I come over here and look at this, that's my web address. So I'm starting from here, API web lists get by title. I'm feeding it the year name, and then I can turn around and say, hey, actually, I want to target content types. And then it's going to say, hey, we need a content type ID for that. So when I look at that specific flow, it's saying content types, hey, I want to add an available content type, and then I'm feeding it the content type ID because that's what's required as input. That content type ID is related to something specific that I have set up. It's an environment variable at the moment, but you get the idea. You can pick up a content type ID and add it directly to your document library without having to go through the faff of click, 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 click. And you can actually add multiple this way as well. That's adding a content type. We have the ability to add specific fields. So again, going down that tree, we've got get by title. We've got then coming down to, if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've looked at this, get by title / fields. Right there, it's saying, hey, we want to add a new field because I've got this as post. And then I'm deciding what the metadata is, what the title of the field is, and what field type it is. These are all kind of documented in the SharePoint REST API in terms of the field types. It takes a bit of digging to find. You have the ability to create views using specific URIs. You can define what the group by setup is and bits like that. A lot of this is really useful for kind of programmatically creating a document structure. And when the reason for specifically this flow was around essentially they upload an Excel file which has a load of information in there, and I'm taking it away and using that to create a document structure and a few other things. Now, there is one other really cool little bit here, which is another part of the SharePoint Designer, the SharePoint List REST API. You can actually apply custom JSON format to a view using the SharePoint REST API. Wasn't entirely sure this was possible when I first started with it, but yeah, there is an endpoint for it. You can select the view, and using the patch function, you can apply a custom formatter. So all of this looks really cool in terms of actually putting it into REST API calls and putting it there. But what does this flow after it's run actually look like? Well, actually, what it looks like is, he says, if it decides to work today. Now I know BRV has had a look at this site before, having managed to take a look. Where is it? Dev. Apply custom JSON format to do. So you can see here, 2024. So you can see there, I've got a load of kind of group by filters. I've got different fields, but the group by filter doesn't have the name of the group by column on it. That's because if I come in here, that user view that I created using REST API, and I hit edit current view, it says it should be here. Oh, don't tell me they've moved it. Some style. No. Full design limit. Of course. There we go. Format current view. All of that. So that was actually all applied programmatically by this REST API there. Yeah, that is essentially just a quick overview of the SharePoint REST API, some of the things you can do with it in terms of how you manage lists, how you might create document libraries, how you read the documentation, what the flows do, what's actually the real kind of limits of it. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.